over there in Quincy, Illinois. Our coach was teaching us to play full court press defense. It's awful. I hate defense. I was always an offensive player, so I was not intent on playing press defense. And at that time, I wasn't all that good, so I was second string. So the first string was playing press defense, while we second stringers were trying to play offense against it. Suited me fine, because for me, defense was always just an afterthought. It still is, for those of you that play. Then after a while, you know how coaches you try to mix in all the players. So he says, McClary, switch to blue. Get in there on offense. Drescher, you go to white. After one play of me on defense, he yells out, McClary, what are you doing? Where are you supposed to be? Don't you know? Well, my eyes got real big because I had no idea where I was supposed to be. He said, what have you been doing? Haven't you been listening and watching? And I think he wanted to make an example out of me. You know, boys that age sometimes don't pay attention very well, and he wanted to kind of shock them, jolt them, and say, hey, you got to pay attention. So he wanted to make an example out of me. And it was one of those times where I just know God reached down, touched my throat, and pulled the right words out that kept me from getting in too much trouble. So I said, no, I was concentrating on offense. I was planning on how to break that press. Well, I kind of caught him off guard, and I think he was wanting to jump me for not listening, but at least I was engaged and working hard. So he kind of smiled and shook his head and said, well, you got to learn to think both ways. Here's where you're supposed to be, and we went on. Always stuck with me, partly because at that point, in 7th grade, I wasn't used to being yelled at for things. I got used to it later on. Did plenty wrong. Anyway, learn to think both ways. Basketball is both offense and defense. You can't have one without the other. It's got to be both. It has to be both. So in basketball, there's both offense and defense. In life, there's both the physical and the spiritual. It's both all the time. It's not one or the other. It's not mostly physical and a little bit spiritual. It's both all the time. We are physical beings. We are spiritual beings. That's important, but so few people really get that. People in our culture are really, really well practiced at living the physical life. Everything about us goes into that. Our energy, our time, our money, everything, feelings, it's all designed to make the physical existence better, because that's what we know. What we think is better. It's designed to make the physical existence better, what we think is better. It's not always better, but that we think it is. But people in our culture are really, really not that well practiced in living the spiritual life, day in, day out, moment by moment. We tend to operate on the physical plane almost all the time, and we kind of tuck the spiritual in now and then when we take a notion. So think about this question. What percentage of time, effort, activity, whatever, would you say the average person spends in physical living as opposed to spiritual living? Attention, time, effort given to physical stuff, what percentage? Just think about it. Don't have to answer. And then answer that question for yourself. How about you? What is it for you, honestly? 90%, 80%? If you're waiting for an answer from me, you're not going to get one because I don't know. And I haven't any surveys or studies about this, but I just thought it was an interesting question because in my experience, it looks like the vast majority of everything we do is all related to the physical. Now, we come to church, we do things a little differently than people that don't have a spiritual relationship with God. But even us, how much of our lives are dominated by the physical? Well, I would say that if we're honest, we are way long on the physical and way short on the spiritual. I'm going to try to represent that by a picture. So here's a picture that tries to represent that relationship. We're going to see the sun. This is a representation of the sun. It's not really the sun. And then the planets are kind of down there below the sun, and they're lined up in order of size. So if you're up close enough, you can probably see down toward the bottom, there's actually a line and an arrow. The arrow is actually bigger than the little dot it's pointing to. That little dot that it's pointing to is the Earth. So in relation to the sun, the Earth is really, really, really small. And that, I think, is a good representation of how, for a lot of people, the relationship between the physical and the spiritual is. The physical dominates the spiritual the way the sun dominates the earth. And that is why, one of the reasons why we get so confused about the spiritual world. Everything about us goes into physical stuff, existence, fun, making us feel certain ways. Everything about us does this. Because we start from the wrong base. We start from the base of thinking about everything from our physical existence, as if that's what's permanent, that's what's real, that's what's all the time. And so everything about us flows into that. And then sometimes we think, oh, there's more, and we try to take a little bit of spirituality and put it into that. Follow me now. I'm going to try to give another physical example to try to illustrate the spiritual. It's like you have a house, and your house may be your life representative. Then you take a little plastic bag full of air, and you try to, from the outside, put that air into the house by trying to find a little gap in the brick. That's kind of silly, but that seems to be how a lot of people are trying to do spirituality. For them, the house is the base, the permanent part, the most important part. It's who we are, it's what we know. Now, not to put people down, because some people try really, really hard. It's just that that concept won't ever get us anywhere, and it will leave us always confused and frustrated about spirituality. We got to turn the whole thing around. We got to start by saying, whoa, the house may seem, the physical may seem permanent, like the most important part, but houses are built into the air. It's there. The air is the reality that moves through all the house. It's always there, always a part of the house. You can't kick it out. You can't take a little bit of it from the outside and try to put it in. It's there. The spiritual part is always there. That is the base. That is the permanent part. And folks, that's the concept that Paul is trying to get across to the people he's arguing with in this passage. We're just about to read it. That's the context for understanding this passage. Now, the Athenians, who he's arguing with here, they don't have much of a concept of the spiritual world. They believe in gods, and they believe the gods are actually physical, but that the gods are so powerful that they can manipulate the physical world to appear or disappear at their whim. Paul gives this great teaching throughout this whole chapter about how, yes, there is a spiritual world beyond the physical that's not captivated by, not bound by the physical. And the one God is above and beyond all things physical, and yet he's also present in the physical. He's trying to teach them that. And he says these, what I believe are immortal words that you've heard many times this morning already and last week. In God, we live, move, and exist. What's he trying to say there? We'll unpack that in a few minutes. So let's do the scripture. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply troubled by all the idols he saw everywhere in the city. See, that's the people they're trying to, their base is the physical form. And so they make these physical statues, these idols, and they think the gods are somehow in those physical idols. He went to the synagogue to debate with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and he spoke daily in the public square to all who happened to be there. He also had a debate with some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. When he told them about Jesus and his resurrection, now he's talking to people who don't believe in resurrection, but he's saying, hey, God was in Jesus and raised him from the dead as proof of God's power. They said, this babbler has picked up some strange ideas. And others said, he's pushing some foreign religion. Then they took him to the council of philosophers. Come and tell us more about this new religion, they said. You're saying some rather startling things, and we want to know what it's all about. Now, it should be explained that all the Athenians, as well as the foreigners in Athens, seemed to spend all their time discussing the latest ideas. So Paul, standing before the council, addressed them as follows. Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious. For as I would, okay, so Paul doesn't come in there wagging his finger at them and saying, you're bad, you shouldn't do this. He says, you know what? He's making a connection on their level. He said, I can tell you're religious people. We have a connection. For as I was walking along, I saw your many altars, and one of them had this inscription on it. to an unknown God. I'll talk more about that in just a minute, why they had that. You've been worshiping him, this unknown God, without knowing who he is. And now I wish to tell you about him. In other words, Paul makes this great connection with the people. He says, you're religious people, and here's this shrine to this unknown God. I know that God. He's known. He's made himself known through Christ Jesus. And I'd like to talk about him. What a great evangelistic witness. And then he goes on to tell about him. He is the God who made the world and everything in it. And since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, he doesn't live in man-made temples. And human hands can't serve his needs, for he has no needs. He himself gives life and breath to everything, and he satisfies every need there is. From one man he created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand which should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. In other words, God is the God of creation, but he's beyond creation as well as involved in it. It's a new concept to them. His purpose in all of this was that the nations should seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. As one of your own poets says, we are his offspring. Okay, now the background information in this is very powerful. Remember they had accused Paul of being a babbler, and he's babbling some foreign religion. And these Athenians thought they were really smart. More about that in a minute. But Paul was a very, very smart man. He knew their literature. And both those phrases, in God we live, move, and exist, and we are his offspring, came from Athenian Greek literature. So that phrase that is in our Bible that we attribute to Christianity alone, in him we live, move, and exist, that was actually written in some of the Athenian literature about their gods, small g. In fact, it was the god Minos, M-I-N-O-S, who was talking to Father Zeus. Remember, this is Greek mythology, what they believed about gods. And he says to Father Zeus, in you we live, move, and exist. So Paul knew that, and he took it and applied it to the one God and shared it back to them, to the Athenians in a different context. And then, as he said, one of the poets says we are his offspring. And since this is true, we shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen from gold or silver or stone. God overlooked people's former ignorance about these things, but now he commands everyone everywhere to turn away from idols and turn to him. In other words, God is not bound up in idols. God is present, and people can know him and can turn to him. For he has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And he proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. That, of course, is Jesus. And he goes on to tell them about Jesus. And that is the new religion. And he's trying to help them understand the new things about God. So Paul utters these words, in God, in him we live, move, and exist. What's he saying? He's saying that the reality of life, the permanent part of life, is found in God, the Spirit of God, the spiritual existence that is what defines us. That's who we are. It's in God that we live, move, and exist. It's the spiritual world that's real and permanent, not the physical. It's not that we exist physically and then we try to figure out how to fit God into that, which is the way most of us do it, but rather we are spiritual beings. And as such, we've got to learn to nurture that part of our existence, our souls. And both our physical and spiritual existences are always there all the time. To concentrate on one to the exclusion of the other is not going to get us to life. But to understand that they're both there all the time in balance is the way to go. But the spiritual has to be seen as the permanent part, the most important part. And that impacts the physical instead of the other way around. Well, the problem is that most people turn that around, with the physical getting the vast majority of attention, time, effort, and so forth. So Paul is there to spread the good news about God's love in Jesus. He's revealed himself, this God who created all the world, who is beyond the world and yet in it, has revealed himself in Jesus of Nazareth. And he's proved it by raising Jesus from the dead and so forth. And he's there to give them this message. They want no part of it. They think that they are smarter than anybody else. Athens, at this point in the world's history, is kind of the gathering place for anybody that wanted to think about lofty things. It's a hotbed of philosophy. There were really, really, really smart people there. And some of them even thought they were smarter than they really were. You know people like that? Thank you. Some of you catch that. In fact, they thought they were the smartest people in the world, and they thought they could figure out everything, all the mysteries of the universe, everything from a purely intellectual, think physical standpoint. To them, everything was based on substance, because that was what was verifiable. And if you could see it, feel it, taste it, whatever, the senses, then it was real. So they tried to figure out the world from this physical substance standpoint. Now, they believed in the existence of gods, but when we think of gods, we think of spiritual. They assumed the gods had substance, physical form. They could just manipulate it. In fact, these people had figured out that there were many gods, and since there were many gods, they thought that, you know what? It's possible that we've forgotten one. And we don't want to do that because that would be offensive to that God. So we need to put up a shrine to the unknown God. And here's how that started. They had a terrible plague that was ravaging their people. People were dying all over the place. So they figured out, they said, oh, we've got the plague because one of the gods must be mad at us. We've offended one of the gods, so we better appease that God. And how did they do it? They did it by sacrifice. And then they said, you know what? We don't know which God it is, so we better appease all of them somehow. And maybe there's one we don't know about, so they thought, let's put up a shrine to the unknown God, sacrifice something to that God, and that'll take care of it. That'll hedge our bets, close the loopholes, so to speak. So what they did was they actually led a whole bunch of sheep into the town, and wherever a sheep paused to rest, lay down, they sacrificed that sheep to whatever god whose statue was nearest. And of course, one of them was kind of near the shrine of the unknown god, so they sacrificed a sheep to the unknown god. This is not crazy. I haven't flipped my wig. This is right there in the history books. And that's why they thought they were serious about this. So they thought that they'd appease whichever god was wreaking havoc on them through the plague. So can you see what they're doing? They're trying to hedge their bets, trying to manipulate the physical to work for them the way they want it to, trying to close the loopholes, trying to set themselves up to win no matter what. Does that sound familiar? It sure does, because we do it today. We do it in so many ways because the physical dominates us, and we try to do everything we can to manipulate the physical so it makes life better for us, or what we think is better. So many ways we do this. The problem is, in trying to use the physical to dominate everything about life, we're completely missing that the spiritual is the reality. Think of it this way, folks. Either the spiritual world is real or it is not. It's one or the other, right? Either the spiritual world's there or it's not. Now, most of us kind of assume that it is. Problem is, that's as far as we go. We tend to approach it from a physical standpoint. You can't be partial in this. We've talked about this before. You can't be partially pregnant. You either are or you aren't. The spiritual world is either real or it is not. If the spiritual world is not real, then what are we left with? Well, we're left with humanity, everything that is, the entire universe, as being a bunch of molecules, atoms, quarks, whatever it is, put together by millions of years of processes, physical processes. There's no guiding purpose or destination. It just all happens. Some people believe that. I don't. I believe the spiritual world is real, and the spiritual world is the reality. So if the spiritual world is real, then there's something beyond the physical which has created the physical, which beckons us, calls us forward, offers us purpose and destination for life, and we call that God, and it's a very personal God. Now, how we can recognize this, and we have a term for it, that we can recognize the reality of the spiritual in many ways. One of the ways is we call it inner restlessness. And it's hard to define that, but it's just not right. Our life is just not right. There's something that makes us restless and out of whack. And we try to, at first, fill it with physical things, and we realize that no amount of physical stuff can solve that, and we recognize, oh, you know what? That's a spiritual hunger. But here's the problem. Many people say they believe in the spiritual world, as all of us do, but then we live completely physically. That's how it goes. You know what I'm saying? People kind of give lip service to soul matters, but we live only in the physical world, taking care of all of our physical hungers, but ignoring the thirst of the soul. And that gives rise to all kinds of things in our lives, problems such as, but not limited to, irritability. How many of you have ever been irritable? Oh, several of you have. And I know you're thinking of somebody else that was irritable, not yourself. I know how that goes. Confusion. I see a hand in the back. Are there others? Just kidding. Despair, frustration. We have those things. By the way, it's high time that pastors and church leaders quit just telling you that you should do spiritual things. It's high time we start modeling, teaching, showing, encouraging, leading how to wake up our souls, how to deal with souls. And I hope and pray that that's what our staff and myself do here at our church. We help you wake up your soul and connect with God. More about that in a minute. So in our society, for the most part, we go through life really concentrating on the physical things, getting fulfilled by food and drink, by substances, physical stuff. We concentrate on this physical, and the spiritual gets the leftovers. Even those of us that go to church weekly, a lot of times we just do the spiritual a couple times a week, church and maybe prayer before bed or something. Thank you to those of you who really are working on your soul existence. That's very, very important. So we live as physical beings, concentrating on physical things. That's what we know. And therefore, what happens is our souls are stunted. I'm going to try to illustrate that with pictures. And here's the difficulty. We are trying to illustrate spiritual things by physical means. I get that. But that's part of how we are created. We think in terms of the physical, but we have to kind of think beyond that and learn to think how the physical represents the spiritual and vice versa. So I'm going to show a picture up here. Think of your soul in terms of a tree that's either very bad and unhealthy or a tree that's very healthy. Let's see. Here's what happens to the soul when we concentrate so much on physical things. Here it is. Does anybody recognize that? Very good. I Googled Snoopy's Christmas tree, and this is what I came up with, right out of Charlie Brown. Yeah, that's a pretty sad-looking tree, isn't it? That is often how our souls are when we don't nurture them as they should be nurtured on an ongoing basis. The tree's still there. It's very, very, very bad shape, but it's still there. You can never not be a spiritual person. It's there. Maybe sick, but it's there. How can you tell if your soul looks like this? Is withered, dry, weak, sick? Well, I mentioned them. Irritability, confusion, frustrated with circumstances, and so on. Anxiety, despair, a lot of brokenness in all your relationships. Do you carry around bitterness, anger, frustration, a lot of self-doubt? Those things are not because of the circumstances you're in. They're not because you don't have enough money. They're not because others have treated you badly. They're not because God or the universe is against you. They happen because your soul looks like this. But when your soul is attended to first, you develop and nurture your soul by all the things we talk about around here, prayer, Bible study, small groups, worship, and so forth, serving, giving. By starting with the assumption that we are a soul, that's who we are at the base. We happen to be in a body for a while. When we start there and live our lives as spiritual people, by assuming that our soul needs life and nurture and sustenance first, by all those things, prayer and so forth, then your soul looks like this. Is that a pretty tree or what? Wow, full. Now there's one more slide, and I don't know why I chose it. I just thought it was beautiful. And this next slide is kind of shows both. I thought that was amazing how they did that. On the one side is the vibrant, lush, wonderful tree. On the other side, it's barren. And I think, man, that's a good picture of a lot of people's lives. Well, anyway, so let's consider just for a couple minutes the negative side of the spiritual world. as a way to also prove the existence of the spiritual world in general. Remember, I'm trying to follow Paul here, who says, folks, the spiritual world is the permanent part. In God, we live, move, and exist. Okay, do you believe evil is real? By the way, that's on our sign out front. There's a whole sequence of questions out there. Do you believe evil is real? Well, most of us do. Look at the mess we have in our world. After thousands of years, many, many, many thousands of years of humanity getting smarter and smarter, having more information, more technology, everything to solve all of our problems, we're not any farther along than we were years and years and years ago, because we still mess things up by murder, greed, selfishness. There must be something else at work. You know, knowledge alone doesn't make things right or better. We believe that, evil has gotten into us and through us. So if evil is real, then the spiritual world is real. Kind of a backward way into it, but most people believe evil's real. Okay, so just think of our movies and all kinds of things that are happening. Most of them are dealing with the occult, the undead, vampires. There's been an explosion the last several years of all those kind of programs coming into our movies and TVs and books and so forth. And what those are is they're people that are experimenting or trying to figure out what is beyond the physical. That's a negative way of doing it, but that's what they're all doing. The explosion of the zombie movies, oh my gosh, they're all over. Series such as The Walking Dead, huge phenomenon in our society, our culture, all trying to explore what is beyond the physical. Unfortunately, they do it from the negative side. But that creates a problem in our society, and here it is. A lot of people are watching this, and they don't start with a strong spiritual foundation. So a lot of people today, their perception of reality is shaped by what? It's what they see on TV and the movies. Now, those of us that didn't grow up with TV and movies, that's not the basis of reality. But a whole bunch of people today are buying into that reality is what they see on TV. Witness this. How many of our shows now are, quote, reality shows? Oh my gosh, all over the place. It's hard for me to watch them because I don't think they're reality. But anyway, that's what people are doing. They're putting more stock in the Hollywood TV movie reality than they are in a Christian worldview. It's out there, folks. It is kind of scary. We shouldn't be scared because we have the truth and we need to keep expressing it. But that's what's happening. People are sensing that the reality is what is being shaped by what they see on TV. And what happens in this is that people get scared of spiritual things, and it's a weird dynamic because they're scared of these spiritual things, evil and so forth, and yet they deny or question the existence of God. See how that's difficult? Witness this. How many people, you don't have to answer this because I know a bunch of you would be embarrassed, but how many of you are scared to go in the cemetery at midnight? Where does that fear come from? TV, movies, books, that kind of thing. Nothing to be scared of out there. Well, unless, anytime dark, I guess there's people that could get you, but not spiritual stuff. Anyway, it's so weird that many people have spiritual fears like that and yet still question the existence of God or question our own spirituality. As I said, either the spiritual world is real or it is not. Evil would love for us to deny the existence of the spiritual world. Wow, we've got to decide today, all the time, day by day, whether we believe we are spiritual beings or we're physical beings that happen to have a soul. Part of our frustration, our concern, our anemia in spiritual things is we've started from the wrong base. We've started with the base that we are physical, and we try to fit spiritual in. It's exactly opposite. We are spirit. We happen to have a body for a while. We've got to learn to attend to our souls with that perspective. Well, a lot of people view religion or spirituality as, and here's another physical example, it's like something we have on the shelf, and we take it down and deal with it when we need it. And that's how we often view spirituality, that it's separate from us. It's a product we take down, handle, look over, study, try to figure out how to use it, and then we put it away when we have to go on with life. Folks, it's exactly opposite, and Paul's phrase here gets to the heart of it. In God, we live, move, and exist. He's telling us that our nature, our soul nature, is not something you take off the shelf now and then. It's not something you go to church once a week to try to figure out, but it's always a part of us. Always, always, always. And our soul is always connected to God's Spirit. That's why it says in God we live, move, and exist. So it makes the case that our soul nature is always a part of us. And we have to decide if our soul is going to look like Snoopy's Christmas tree or a healthy, blooming, thriving tree. I and the staff here, we view our job not as running the church, although we do need to. We view our jobs not as making sure the committees are functioning, although, it's good to have healthy committees. We view our jobs not as trying to get more people to come in the doors, not as trying to get our church to be some great church in the area, but rather our job is to help your soul wake up and help your soul tap into the living God, the Spirit of the living God. When we can do that, we'll see a movement here that is unequaled. How do you tell if your soul is waking up, if you're starting to come alive spiritually? Well, you get curiouser. You get more in tune to trying to figure out spiritual stuff. You get restless. You're unsettled with the way things are. You think there's more. Don't view that as bad or scary. That's good. That's your soul getting some attention. We hope to fan that flame, help you live as a spiritual being more and more and more. And when we do that, people out there that aren't here yet, don't have a connection with God, they'll notice something different about us, and they'll be hungry for it. And they'll say, what is it about those people? What is it? And we'll say, you know what? All I can say is that my soul is waking up, and then we can go on from there. At Glenn Yoder's service yesterday, Glenn, former pastor at our church, who went to be with God just not too long ago, that was a great, it's the way funeral services ought to be. Pastor did a great job. He said this about Glenn. Through him shined the light of Jesus, and others came to that light because of Glenn. Now, we didn't see actual light waves emanating off of Glenn, but as you got to know him, you knew there was something different about him. And it was that he wasn't bound up in the physical. He knew about his soul, and his soul was nurtured and tended to first, and that is what governed his life. And we can do the same. Thank you, O God, for this time together. Thank you for your presence here. God, we humbly confess that the vast majority of us is spent on figuring out the physical and surviving and living in this physical world. Help us, O God, to open up to your eternal soul and to turn that around. Help us to live moment by moment, day by day, knowing that we are a soul. It's who we are. Help us to take this phrase that you gave to the Athenians and then to Paul. In you, O God, we live, move, and exist. Help us to take that phrase as a guiding principle for our lives, so that when circumstances are seemingly piling up against us, we recognize it's not circumstances that are a problem. It's the problem is that our soul has not been attended to. Help us, O God, here at First United Methodist to be people of soul, people who know how to nurture and tend to our souls through worship, through prayer, through giving and serving, so that what happens is, God, we wake up to you and the flow of your Holy Spirit in and through us all the time. To that end, we give ourselves. In Jesus' name, amen.